there, BookTube. Welcome back to my channel. It is Friday, September 27th. We're here for a Friday Reads check-in. These are some of the books that I have finished since the last time I did a check-in, which was 2 weeks ago. So it's not like I read all these books in 1 week. I read them over 2 weeks. I didn't post a Friday Reads check-in last Friday because I filmed it but didn't have a chance to edit it. And then it wasn't Friday anymore. So I'm gonna recap some of the books that I have read in the last 2 weeks. We're not going to go through them in detail because, well, for different reasons. The first two are books that I've already reviewed here on the channel. One is the 1974 Booker Prize winner, which I posted a single book review of this one here on the channel. Stanley Middleton's Holiday, which I'm recommending that you watch that video, so I'll link it down below, and also I'm recommending that you read it. I also reviewed Salman Rushdie's Quichotte, which is currently nominated, shortlisted for this year's Booker Prize win, and I enjoyed a lot of things about this book. Didn't quite get the resolution, didn't quite get if this book was resolved and whether it was satisfactory or not, but discuss this in more detail in my review, which I'll also link in the description box down below. Salman Rushdie's Quichotte and Stanley Middleton's Holiday, those are two books that I read in the last 2 weeks, which I won't talk about here because I've already spoken about them. Then we have two books that I read for Latinx-a-thon. I read Roxane Gay's short story collection, Difficult Women, and I read this one because, well, I participated in Latinx-a-thon because I saw other people doing it. I watched Ciriella Alba's video, and she talked about the two of the books that were on her TBR, and it prompted me to choose these two books. One of the prompts for Latinx-a-thon was to read a book by an author who is from a non-Spanish speaking Latin American country, whether the author is from that country or has heritage that is connected to that country. And so I read Roxane Gay for that reason, because her family is from Haiti. This collection, as it is titled, feature women who may be difficult, may be seen as difficult, or may have just been put into very difficult situations, and through Gay's writing we get to see how they survive, how they triumph over their circumstances. And this one was set in lots of different places around the country, and the characters they come alive on the pages. She dealt with a lot of different themes in this one, and like the first story, we see two sisters who've been abused, and because of the tight bond that they had when they were abused, sexually abused when they were children, even as adults they refused to be physically separated. So one follows her sister across the country to go see her husband because they just can't be away from each other. We get stories in here that follow multiple characters, kind of like a short multi-perspective novel which deals with weight issues, and all the characters that we meet are weighing in. Great pun, Karen. They're all weighing in on how they all relate to this idea of weight in this very appearance focused community. Lots of scenes, lots of scenarios, lots of different kinds of characters, and I'm glad that I read this one because I bought it recently, and it's good to not have books languishing on your shelf unread for a really long time, right? The other book that I read for Latinx-a-thon was another book from my shelf, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, A General in His Labyrinth. And this one, even though it's not specifically said on the front, this one follows the story of General Simon Bolivar, who had this idea of uniting the countries in South America. And this one follows his later parts of his life after he's endured the wars and done all the travels and led the countries, founded the countries and led the countries, how his legacy turned in the latter parts of his life. And it's fascinating. And Gabriel Garcia Marquez, even though he's typically known for writing magical realism, this one is historical fiction. There isn't much magic being presented, but we have the same kind of backdrop, the same kind of writing that we find in his other books like Love in the Time of Cholera and 100 Years of Solitude, both of which I have read and loved. And this one is intensely interesting. I'm not completely familiar with the history of Simon Bolivar, so it was really good to read this one and to read it from the perspective of someone who is from that area. So read and loved those two for Latinx-a-thon. Other books that I finished last week were Men and Gods by Rex Warner. This one was illustrated by Edward Gorey. And this is a small book and pretty short book. I first knew about this book. I think I may have read this book, maybe not in its entirety, but I read this book in some part when I was a teenager because it was on my brother's reading list. My brother is 3.5 years older than I am. And when he started high school, which in Jamaica was the junior high school part of high school, this was on his reading list. And I love to read my brother's books because I felt older when I read the books that he was reading. And I remember reading this as a child and being fascinated by the stories that were told in here. And recently I saw this title mentioned and I said, I have to request that. So I requested it from the library. And this one is, again, Myths and Legends from the Greek. And the author presents each one in story format. So there are many stories in here. We start with Pyramus and Thisbe, and we go on to the story of Cadmus and Bacchus and Icarus and Theseus and Midas, and all the Greeks. All their stories are in this one, and it is written in language that you can present Greek mythology to very young readers. But for someone like me who's just interested in some of the stories that have formed the backdrop of a lot of literature, this for me feels like a reference book. So while I read this one from the library, I think I may buy a copy. Maybe not necessarily this one, but I feel like I need something of Greek mythology in my library. So I'm going to be looking for something else. If you have a recommendation of some kind of a compendium of the Greek gods and Greek myths and legends, something that's maybe a little bit more advanced, you can leave that as a recommendation for me in the comments down below. I also read last week an ebook. I read Ursula K. Le Guin's The Word for World is Forest. And I read that on the recommendation of Mel, I think. Mel from Mel's Bookland Adventures, I think, told me to check that one out. Because I've been seeing a lot of Ursula K. Le Guin's writings pop up. And I've never read anything from her, so I wanted to check out something from her. And she writes science fiction. So, well, she wrote science fiction. She has died now. But I'm not a huge science fiction fan, so Mel suggested that I check this one out because it is short, and it was a novella. It was very interesting. Word for World is Forest is science fiction. It is set in another planet, another realm, and centuries in the future. And Earth has pretty much been deforested because of the very unsustainable practices that we have of cutting down trees and not replacing them here. And eventually, centuries later, I don't know if it will take centuries, but eventually the humans, or humans as they're called in this novel, have colonized a new planet called Ashura. And they've enslaved the people. And they are doing the same practices that landed them in that plight in the first place. So they have found this new planet. They have enslaved the people. They are using the women as sex slaves. And they are still cutting down all the trees. And eventually the inhabitants of this new planet rebel. Through her writing, Le Guin makes these really bold political statements about the tendency for humans to engage in these practices like slavery and colonization and bad industrial practices for financial gain. And it was fascinating. The story itself was fascinating. It's not going to make me a huge science fiction fan just because that's just not my preferred genre to read. But the book itself was really good. It was well presented. I thought some of it was really graphic, and some of it was difficult to read, but I'm glad that I read it. So I read my first Ursula K. Le Guin last week, and those are my last week's readings. So now we're up to this week's reading. The first book that I finished this week was The Stationery Shop by Marjan Kamali. You guys picked this one from a page 112 tag video that I did recently, so I'll link that video down below if you want to see why I read this one as opposed to the other two books that I could have potentially picked up. The Stationery Shop covers multiple timelines, and this book is proof of why you shouldn't stop reading a book in the middle and think that you know where the story is going. The main character in this one is a 17-year-old girl named Roya, and she's living in Tehran, Iran. Her parents are pretty liberal, and so they've accepted the idea that girls should be educated. And they're living at the time when Reza Shah has left the country and they have a democratically elected prime minister. But there is fear that the Shah is gaining ground again, and so people have become very political. They're trying to make sure that democracy reigns. So this is in 1953. And Reza falls in love with a boy who is a political activist. In 2013, she reconnects with this boy that she knew when she was a teenager. And as the story goes back and forth, as we go back to the 1950s and then go to the 1960s and 70s and go through the ages, we see the history of Iranian revolution and how it affects people and their personal relationships and how it relates to what they do with their lives. So this book feels a little bit like historical fiction, feels a little bit like historical romance, but I'm not sure how to categorize it other than to say that it was good. I really liked the plot. The writing, not as much. There were places like the story relies a lot on dialogue. And for me, I just felt like for me to really have loved this story, I needed a little bit more atmosphere in terms of description as opposed to dialogue. The dialogue felt like it was being delivered by characters who were rehearsing for a stage play. I heard Sean the Book Maniac say that in his video this morning, and I said the same thing when I was reading this book. I wrote a review for it yesterday, and I was thinking the same thing. But I really liked the story. I liked the plot. I thought that the author did a really good job of trying to tell all the stories that were related here. But ultimately, I'm giving this one 3 stars just because the writing itself, I felt, didn't give the story justice. Another book that I finished this week, which I won't go into too much detail because this is a previous Man Booker winner that I'm going to do a full book review for. This was Roddy Doyle's 1993 Booker Prize winning novel, Patti Clarke. Ha ha ha. This one is set in Barrytown, Ireland, and it follows Paddy, who's a 10-year-old boy, although the boy that's pictured here doesn't look like he's quite 10, but he could be. Patti Clarke is a 10-year-old boy living in the 1960s in Ireland, and this book is written in stream of consciousness format as he's trying to understand the world and understanding the pervasive cycle of violence. He's looking at the escalating violent dynamics between his parents, where their arguments move from calm disagreements to shouts to physical violence, and how that affects him, how it affects the relationship that he has with his younger brother, and how these children, who are probably all learning the same things from their parents, how they take what they're learning from their parents and act it out with each other and with their world, with their community around them. This one is not a coming-of-age novel, and it doesn't feature any heroes. In fact, Paddy seems to come across as the anti-hero because he is just a terrible, impish little kid, or at least that's what it seems like. But the focus of this book is just showing, I think, how children are affected by what goes on around them and how they understand the world based on the tools that they've been given by the adults in their lives. And I'm going to be talking more about this in a video because I will review this for my Man Booker series at some point. 1993, so that's going to come up shortly. Not quite yet, but shortly. The other book that I read, well, I still have 3 more books to tell you about. The first one is The Stranger by Albert Camus. I was reading this one because of Gone with the Book readathon, which started on September 24th. For the last 7 days of September, I'm trying to read books that were written or published between 1900 and 1950. This one is the first of those books that I started and finished, because this one is really short. It's 123 pages and I read it in a day. The Stranger is translated from French by Matthew Ward. And I don't know, I always thought that Albert Camus was from France. This one is set in Algeria. And it is a startling novella just because, again, here we have an anti-hero. We have a young man named Meursault who seems to be, I don't know what it was like in the 1900s when this book was written, but present day, Meursault would have been diagnosed with some kind of a social or personality disorder because he seems to be autistic. He doesn't seem to have any capacity for emotional connection. And because of that inability, he is categorized and criticized and seems like victimized for it. And so we have this young man, Meursault, who seems to be just going about the trivialities and banalities of his life. He's just doing his job. He finds out his mother has died. She's living in a home, and he goes to bury her, but he's concerned about the time that he's taking off from his job. He seems like a very conscientious person, and in his interactions with people around him, we see them kind of taking advantage of the fact that he doesn't make extraneous demands on people. He kind of goes along with the flow, but then he seems to act a little bit out of character and gets involved with this man and friends, and somehow becomes involved in a murder on this beach in Algeria. And the story examines how he deals with what happens and gives us much later part of his introspection, gives us finally some details about why he became what he became. And it forces the reader to contemplate humanity from different perspectives, contemplate the character of Meursault and how he deals with what is going on, but also to question why he doesn't do otherwise. And again, because this is 2019, I'm thinking that he might have had some mental or social disorder that challenged him in a way that he couldn't, but suppose he didn't. I don't know. I really enjoyed this book. Albert Camus. So this was my first time reading anything by this author, and of course he's a Nobel Prize winning author for literature, so I'm gonna try to read more from him. The Plague, I think, is the next book I'm gonna try to pick up from Albert Camus. And then this is a book that I finished last week but didn't go into because I wanted to connect it with this book. I finished The Brick. The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson tells the story of the Great Migration of African Americans who left the South of the United States from the early 1900s up until about 1970 because they were escaping segregation and the racial injustice that led to things like Jim Crow laws and color barriers, and they really didn't stop moving until the successes of the civil rights movement started to be adopted in the late 1960s to 1970. So I was doing a buddy read of this one and I finished it today, and man, this was a whopper. Isabel Wilkerson essentially took three individuals and wrote their memoirs as the personification of the history. And so we followed these three individuals from their early lives and up until their death. We get to see a lot of these lives come full circle. And these migrants, after they've raised their children, you know, see the impact of the move on the people who left themselves, but also on their children and their children's children. Children who are not born in the South and so don't have the same appreciation for some of the struggles that their parents went through. And, you know, having these men and women who left and sacrificed a lot to leave the South and try to make it in the North and deal with a lot of the same discrimination, a lot of the same lack of opportunities that they were trying to escape. And to see their children not appreciate the sacrifices and make a lot of mistakes that they feel like they shouldn't. And it was a fantastic read. Fantastic opportunity to reflect on that dichotomy of experiences between the people who were migrants and the children that they had. And so because of what we were reading, Doris had suggested that we read this middle grade book called The Watsons Go to Birmingham 1963 by Christopher Paul Curtis. This is a middle grade book that takes that experience and writes it through the eyes of a child who was born in Flint, Michigan, and is himself the child of a woman who migrated from the South. And in this one, we have one of the children acting out and the parents deciding to send him back to the South to be reformed. So because this kid has been acting out, acting like he's a juvenile delinquent, they've decided to send him to Birmingham, Alabama, so his grandmother could raise him upright. And unfortunately, when they decide to go, or when they decide to make that trip, it is 1963. And one of the things that happened in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, was the bombing of the church that killed those 4 little girls. And so that story is covered in here as well. So I read these two as companions. I finished this one last week because it's a really short middle grade read. And I enjoyed this. Middle grade is not my thing, but I enjoyed it just because I was also reading this. I think maybe without this, I might not have enjoyed the middle grade book as much, but I finished the brick. So those are 17 books that I have finished, completely finished for this month. I have a lot more books coming up. These are some of the books that I'm planning to finish over the weekend. These 3 I'm hoping to finish today. I started The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and this is really readable. It reads just like a movie, so I think I'll be able to finish this one this afternoon. I really like the writing. I don't think I've ever read anything by F. Scott Fitzgerald before. I'm reading this one because of Gone with the Book Readathon as well, because this one was published in the 1920s. And I'm also reading Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. This one was published in the early 1900s as well. And this is a Barnes & Noble classic. I took this one from my husband's shelf. And Heart of Darkness is just one of the stories in here. But it is preceded by a short story that follows the same main character. So I decided to read that short story before I read Heart of Darkness, and I'm still reading that short story called Youth, and then I'm going to read Heart of Darkness afterwards. So I'm hoping to finish those this afternoon, as well as I'm reading The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. This one is from the 1600s. I think it is Christian fiction, and it follows the life of a Christian. So it takes the spiritual journey that a Christian has to make in order to get to heaven and personalizes it through the physical journey of a character named Pilgrim, who has to pass all these tests and endure all these trials before he can get to the land of light. And on Friday evenings, I don't read secular fiction because I celebrate the Sabbath. So I'll be reading this one sometime tonight. I might finish it. We'll see. I'm also reading Greed by Elfriede Jelinek, which is, Elfriede Jelinek is a Nobel Prize winning novelist. So I chose this one because Britta read it for her Noble Women read-along group recently, and I've been trying to read it for a couple of months now, but it's hard to read. It's about a country policeman who's extremely greedy. So he's living in a time where men are valued by women and property is valued by men. And so he's kind of prostituting himself to the women in his constituency because he wants their houses when they die. And the story itself is interesting, but the text is so dense and it doesn't have any breaks. So that's why it's taking me so long to read that one, but I must finish it. I must finish it. I'm also reading Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. I don't know why I haven't gotten back to that book yet. That's from my Booker Prize reading. I'm also still planning to return to History of the Rain by Neil Williams, which I started last week and was really trying to get into the story, but it is so literary dense. It's about a girl whose father has died and left her the legacy of 3,000 books in their personal home library. And the story doesn't seem to have a plot, but she's telling the story of her family through recounting anecdotes or making comparisons with characters from the books in this 3,000 volume library that she has. I don't know. I need to get back to this book. I want to read it, but I put it aside for a while and I will get back to it. The last two are also for the Gone with the Book readathon. These are both slim volumes, so I'm sure that I can manage to knock these out before the end of the month. Booker T. Washington's memoir, Up From Slavery. Booker T. Washington himself was born in slavery, but rose up to become a very prominent and influential man in his community. He spoke a lot about the education of African Americans during this time period. And I also have Ian Forster's Room with a View, which is about a wealthy woman who's pulled towards two different relationships, one with a lower class man who has a son, and one with an upper class man who meets her social standards. And I'm hoping to read both of these as well for the Gone with the Book readathon, which goes up until the end of September. So for 30 books in 30 days, so far I've finished 17 books. I'm on track to finish books 18, 19, and 20 today. And we're at September 27th. If I have the kind of reading weekend that I'm anticipating, we will make it. But I'll be here to have a check-in on Monday and let you know how it went. So thanks for watching this video. Give me a thumbs up if you liked it. I hope it wasn't too long. I hope I wasn't too long-winded and didn't bore you to tears with all my reading. But I've been having a fantastic reading month. All of these books have spoken to me in some way or another, and I just wanted to communicate that with you and share my excitement at having this fantastic literary month with you all. So thanks for watching. I'd love to talk with you in the comments if you've read any of these. I want to comment if you have any recommendations from me for the next thing that I should read from these authors. Let's just talk in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. So let's talk down there, and until next time, happy reading. Bye.